In the cold, damp cell beneath the Red Keep, Eddard Stark sat hunched against the stone wall, his hair matted and his body weak from days without proper food. The chains around his wrists chafed his skin, but he had long stopped noticing the pain. It was nothing compared to the weight in his heart. Not for the crimes he had confessed to, those were lies forced from him. It was the burden of the truth he had decided to bury. Ned had always believed in honor. It was the thing that shaped him, made him who he was. But honor alone had led him to the dungeons, betrayed by Littlefinger, manipulated by Cersei, and crushed by the politics of a cruel and deadly court. And yet, in the silence of his cell, Ned had begun to think differently. He had started to wonder, what if he could use this dishonor to serve a greater purpose? He had received the offer from Varys the Spider, the Whisperer. Confess your crimes, swear fealty to Joffrey, and you'll be sent to the Wall. You'll live. Your daughters will be spared, and the realm will remain in peace. But Ned saw through the offer. It wasn't about peace. It was about control. Cersei wanted him silent, far from court. Joffrey wanted to make a statement, and Varys, well, he claimed to serve the realm, but even spiders have their own webs. What none of them realized was that Ned had already made his decision. He had chosen to die, not for pride, not for some poetic sense of justice, but because he believed it was the only way to ignite something larger, something that would burn through the lies of King's Landing and reach the north. His death could be a message, a spark. He had sent a message to his wife Catelyn through an old servant of the Red Keep he knew from his days with Robert. The man owed him a life debt from the rebellion. Tell her to trust no one, not even her uncle. Go to Robb, prepare for war. Tell him the North must remember. When the guards came the next morning, they found Ned calm, even peaceful. He did not fight as they unchained him. He walked slowly, like a man resigned, but in his mind he was already far away, watching Winterfell's fires, hearing the howls of wolves in the dark. He would die as a traitor, but in truth he would be dying a wolf's death, planned, cold and calculated. On the steps of the Great Sept, the crowd had gathered. Joffrey sat on the Iron Throne like a child playing king, smug and dangerous. Sansa wept. Arya, hidden in the crowd with Yoren, had no idea she was playing a role in her father's last move. As Ned was dragged forward and knelt before the steps, he looked up at the sky, clear and blue, strangely peaceful. He began to speak, reciting the confession Varys had written for him. He called himself a traitor, said he had plotted with Stannis, said he deserved death. And then he looked straight at Sansa, his poor naive daughter, and gave the smallest shake of his head. The kind of gesture only a father would recognize. It wasn't real. None of it was. When Ser Ilyn raised the sword, Ned didn't flinch. The final blow came fast, and the crowd gasped. But far away in the north, wheels had begun to turn. Letters had been read, orders given. Robb Stark, the young wolf, had already begun to march. Ned Stark had just made his final move, and it was war ** at Winterfell. The Raven came at dusk. The sky was painted in orange and red, as if the gods themselves mourned what had just happened. Maester Luwin read the message in silence, his hands trembling as he stood before Catelyn. Stark, she looked older in that moment, her eyes tired, lips drawn tight. She didn't cry. Not when he said the words aloud. Lord Eddard Stark has been executed on the orders of King Joffrey Baratheon. Her heart shattered quietly, like snow breaking underfoot. But then Maester Luwin handed her a second note, smaller, folded in a way only Ned would do, his personal seal. Catelyn's hands shook as she read the message. It wasn't a farewell, it was a warning. He plans to kill the wolf to save the pack. Trust no one. Take our son and prepare for fire. She knew then he had planned this. Ned Stark had chosen to die. By morning, Catelyn was on the move. She met Robb in the Great Hall. The boy had just been pushed into manhood overnight. "Our Lord of Winterfell now," she said, voice steady. "But soon you must be more." Robb didn't ask for details. He had been raised by Ned Stark. He understood what wasn't said aloud. That very night, banners were raised. The northern houses, Umber, Karstark, Manderley, Glover answered the call. They didn't just march for revenge. They marched because they saw what the South had done to their warden. They marched because the South had drawn first blood. The North remembers. Meanwhile, far across the country, Arya was on the run, disguised. As a boy, traveling with Night's Watch recruits, she rode in silence, but her eyes held something different now. Not just grief, a purpose. She had seen her father die for reasons she couldn't yet understand, but she remembered his look before. The end, the smallest shake of his head. He wasn't begging for life. He was telling her to survive, to keep going, and she would in the Riverlands. Catelyn met with her father's bannermen. Hoster Tully was sick, but still breathing. Edmure brash and foolish wanted immediate battle. But Catelyn, with her grief turned to ice, pushed a different plan. We don't just fight them, we outthink them. We use Ned's death the way he wanted us, two like a sword in the dark. Robb rode at the head of 20,000 Northmen. Word of his army spread quickly through Westeros. But Robb wasn't heading to King's Landing, not yet. First, he needed alliances. The Freys were bought with promises of marriage. The Tullys stood with him in grief and blood. And the Riverlands, already burning under Lannister raids, welcomed Robb's vengeance. Back in King's Landing, chaos bloomed. Sansa Stark remained in the Red Keep, broken and confused. Joffrey enjoyed her tears. He made her look at her father's head on a spike. But behind her fear, Sansa was changing. She stopped dreaming. She stopped hoping. She began observing, listening, quietly learning how the game was played. Varys knew something had gone wrong. Ned's death wasn't supposed to trigger war. It was meant to end it. But the North hadn't submitted. They had risen. He approached Littlefinger, but Pettyr only smiled. "A little chaos is a ladder," he said. "Let them climb." What no one realized yet was that Ned Stark had never played to win the Game of Thrones. He had simply tilted the board. Stannis Baratheon received a raven too, carrying a copy of a letter Ned had written before his death. It named Joffrey a bastard, born of incest, not true heir to the throne. Ned's final truth had reached Dragonstone, and with that, Stannis began to plan. One death had opened a dozen paths: rebellion, revenge, war. In every corner of Westeros, people whispered about the North's fury, about the Wolf King who now marched south, and as Catelyn Stark stood by the river, watching her son's army assemble, she felt it deep inside her. Ned's death was not an end. It was the beginning. The drums of war echoed through the Riverlands as Robb Stark's army began its march. The banners of the direwolf flew high across the countryside, a symbol of vengeance that reached even the ears of the Lannisters. Lords once hesitant now stepped forward, each with blood debts to settle. Tywin Lannister, ever calculating, summoned his bannermen and prepared his response. But he underestimated the boy from the north. At the camps near Moat Cailin, Robb sat with Catelyn, Grey Wind beside him. The direwolf had grown restless, snarling at the scent of Lannister scouts nearby. "Do you think father knew this would happen?" Robb asked quietly, staring into the fire. Catelyn's face was unreadable. "He didn't just know," she replied. "He wanted it." It sounded cruel. It sounded impossible. But in her heart, she knew Ned had chosen a larger battle. He had sacrificed his name, his honor, and his life to shake the kingdom awake. Word came swiftly that Jaime Lannister was leading raids across the Riverlands. Villages burned, innocents slaughtered. Robb changed course and ordered a surprise march. At the Whispering Wood, he found Jaime's forces stretched thin and vulnerable. In the dead of night, with the trees silent and still, the northern army attacked. Robb's plan was bold. He split his forces, lured Jaime into a trap, and struck with unrelenting fury. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. Jaime was captured, dragged before Robb in chains. For a brief moment, the Lannister smugness faltered. "You're just a boy," Jaime spat, blood trickling from his lip. "And you're my prisoner," Robb answered. The news of Jaime's capture shocked King's Landing. Tywin Lannister was furious. Cersei was terrified. Without her brother, her grip on the throne weakened, but the boy King Joffrey only grew. More reckless, ordering more executions, threatening Sansa, and dismissing any council that dared speak of peace. Varys, ever the whisperer, worked behind the scenes. He knew war was now inevitable. But what disturbed him more was how precisely it had unfolded, almost as if guided. And there was one letter Ned Stark had left behind, locked away in the vaults of the Citadel. A letter only one old maester had the right to open. That letter would later become the thread that unraveled the Targaryen secret. But for now, it remained hidden like a dagger sheathed, waiting for its time. In the north, a darker plot was brewing. The Boltons had pledged themselves to Robb, but Roose Bolton had begun making his own calculations. He admired the boy's victories, but distrusted his sentiment. A war of wolves could not be won with loyalty alone. Roose was watching, waiting for weakness. Meanwhile, Arya's journey took her across war-torn fields. Every village she passed bore signs of conflict, bodies hung on trees, children begging for bread, women weeping in ashes. She hardened with every step. Her list began to grow. Cersei, Joffrey, the Hound, Ilyn Payne. The names stayed with her, whispered like a prayer in the dark. And at Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon lit his fires. Melisandre whispered to him of the false king in the capital, of the bastard-born prince. Stannis, stubborn and hungry for justice, saw himself as Westeros' savior. "The Lord of Light has shown me," Melisandre told him, "a direwolf burning in fire, and from the flames a stag with a broken crown." Back at Riverrun, Robb received a visitor, a cloaked figure who claimed to be a loyal servant of his father. The man delivered Ned Stark's final words, spoken just before execution. "Tell my son the game is not about thrones. It's about survival. And survival sometimes needs the death of the father to awaken the wolf." Robb read the message again and again until the ink blurred. "He wanted me to become this," he whispered. Catelyn placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then become it. Not just for revenge. For the North, the war had only just begun. But Robb Stark was no longer just a son. He was a king in the making, and every victory came with a cost." The cheers from the north echoed through the Riverlands after Jaime Lannister's capture. But victory has a strange way of inviting betrayal. Robb Stark stood taller, his commands firmer, his army more united than ever on the surface. But beneath the cloak of banners and bloodshed, old lords began sharpening different blades. Not all men were built for loyalty. At Harrenhal, Robb ordered his men to hold position while he sent word to his bannermen for supplies. Roose Bolton, ever cold and calm, volunteered to garrison the ancient castle. Robb agreed, unaware that the man's quiet voice hid ambitions just as sharp as any sword. "You serve the king in the north," Robb reminded him. "I serve the winning side," Roose replied, his tone flat, respectful but full of meaning. Far to the east, word of the war reached Daenerys Targaryen. She sat under the red sun of Qarth, nursing dragons no larger than cats. But when a trader from Westeros spoke of Ned Stark's death and the war it sparked, she listened carefully. A usurped throne, a bastard king, a country in chaos. Perhaps it was time the dragon returned. In King's Landing, Sansa was a prisoner in every sense of the word. The court dressed her in silks, fed her lies, and paraded her grief as a lesson in loyalty. But she watched, learned. She saw the way Cersei spoke only in smiles laced with poison. She noticed how Varys and Littlefinger moved like shadows behind the throne. And she began to understand that the game her father died trying to expose was far more wicked than she ever imagined. One evening, during a feast to celebrate some minor Lannister victory, Joffrey dragged her to court and forced her to kneel. "Your traitor father died screaming," he said, "and your brother will too." Sansa said nothing. She met his eyes. She didn't cry. And for the first time, someone at Court Tyrion Lannister noticed the steel beneath the girl's pain. "She's not broken," he told Bronn later. "She's surviving." Robb, meanwhile, faced his first true political test. The Freys had delivered troops at the price of a marriage alliance. But Robb, young and battle-hardened, had made the mistake of falling in love with Talisa Megia, a healer from Volantis. Their marriage, while private, would not remain secret for long. Catelyn was furious. "You don't understand what you've done," she hissed. "You've shamed Walder Frey, and men like him don't forget." Robb thought he could calm the storm later, but the seed of the Red Wedding was already sown. In the dungeons beneath Riverrun, Jaime Lannister sat in chains, his golden hair dirty, his pride bruised. But even caged, the Kingslayer played the long game. "Your father died because he was too honorable," he told Catelyn during one of her visits. "You want to win. Stop playing the honest man's game." The words haunted her. Arya, on the other hand, was no longer a child of innocence. Traveling with the Night's Watch men and the mysterious Jaqen H'ghar, she began to see death differently. Quiet, inevitable, controlled. Jaqen gave her 3 lives to claim. She didn't hesitate. Arya was no longer running. She was hunting. As the war dragged on, the northern forces won battle after battle. But something darker was awakening, not in King's Landing, not in Riverrun, but beyond the wall, at Castle. Black Jon Snow had ridden north with Corin Halfhand deep into the wild. There, among the snow and whispers, he began to understand that the real enemy wasn't the one on the throne, but the one forgotten in stories. Ned Stark's plan had been to protect the North, even if it cost him his name. But war has no loyalty. His death had indeed awakened the wolf, but it had also awoken the vultures. And as Robb marched further south, seeking to press his advantage, Varys sent a final raven north addressed not to a king, not to a lord, but to Maester Luwin at Winterfell. The game you play began with Eddard Stark, but it will not end with his son. The campfires of Robb Stark's army glowed like scattered stars across the Riverlands. He had never lost a battle, and yet the victories tasted bitter. The war was stretching thin, not just in supply and strategy, but in trust. Every win brought him closer to King's Landing, and yet further from home. At Riverrun, Catelyn Stark grew restless. Word had reached her that Bran and Rickon were dead, murdered by Theon Greyjoy, her son's former friend. The letter had come with a seal from the Iron Islands. She wept alone, then rose harder than ever. "We lost Ned, now my boys," she whispered. But somewhere deep inside her, she wondered if Ned had foreseen this, if his sacrifice had unknowingly opened gates to chaos too wide to shut. Robb didn't speak of Bran or Rickon, not in the war tent, not in his mother's presence. But Talisa saw the grief breaking through in rare moments. "They're saying you fight like a wolf," she said once. But wolves mourn too. Roose Bolton returned to the camp with cold news and colder ideas. "We cannot keep winning like this. You've made enemies of the Freys. The Karstarks are angry. Your uncle wants more land. These men follow you because they believe, but belief fades faster than gold." Robb dismissed him, not yet seeing how deeply the cracks were spreading. He still believed in the cause, in the idea that justice, like winter, would come for those who had murdered his father. But justice is a sharp thing, and it cuts in all directions. Catelyn made a desperate choice, knowing how dangerous Jaime Lannister was, but also how valuable he could be. She freed him under Brienne's watch. A trade Jaime for her daughters. Robb was livid. The tent erupted in rage. "You've betrayed my trust," he shouted, voice shaking. "I did what Ned would have done," she replied. But the truth was, neither of them were Ned, and his absence was becoming a chasm too wide to cross. In King's Landing, Sansa still played the role of obedient lady, but Tyrion Lannister now served as Hand of the King. He knew the war was going badly, and his sister's grip was loosening. He warned her that killing Ned Stark had only made the North stronger. Cersei shrugged. "Let the wolves play their little war. They'll eat each other soon enough." What she didn't know was that Robb had been offered an alliance, sealed not by marriage, but by fire. Melisandre had sent a raven from Dragonstone. "Your father believed in truth," the message said. "But truth is fire, and only those born in flame can reshape the world." Stannis, with his cold justice and flaming heart, wanted an alliance with the North. Robb considered it. For the first time, he felt the weight of decisions far greater than swordplay. But before any pact could be made, disaster struck. The Karstarks, furious over Catelyn's release of Jaime, killed 2 Lannister prisoners in their cell. Robb had no choice but to execute the murderers. The cost. The Karstarks withdrew their men from the war, thousands gone in one day. Robb's army began to feel smaller, colder. The howls of grey wind felt lonelier at night. In the shadows, Roose Bolton wrote letters, quiet ones, sent with no banners, sealed with no crests. And one of those letters flew straight to the twins at Winterfell. The truth emerged. Bran and Rickon were alive. Theon's betrayal had been a cruel illusion, a game of scorched bodies and broken loyalties. Maester Luwin sent word as fast as ravens could fly. Catelyn fell to her knees when she read the letter. Robb stood still for a long time, then whispered, "My brothers live. That means the North lives." But the reprieve didn't last. A message from Walder Frey arrived, colder than ice. He had heard of Rob's marriage to Talisa. He demanded recompense. An apology, a feast. Rob agreed. And Catelyn, who had once believed that Ned's death had given them purpose, now feared. It had only brought them to ruin. She said nothing at first, but as the preparations for the feast at the twins began, she approached Rob one last time. Your father died to wake the wolf, but not all wolves survived the winter. Rob held her hand, silent. He didn't know it yet, but the trap was already set. The letter Roose sent had done its work. Walder Frey had already started ordering extra wine, extra chains, extra knives. The North was remembering, but so were its enemies. The twins stood, tall and narrow, over the river, their shadows stretching long across the field as Robb Stark's army approached. The banners of House Frey waved listlessly in the breeze, neither welcoming nor threatening, just watching. The gates opened, but warmth never followed. Robb wore his crown, but not his armor. Talisa rode beside him, her eyes cautious. Catelyn followed in silence, sensing a coldness that no fire could melt. Be wary, she had warned. They smile with their teeth, here. Walder Frey received them with a twisted grin, his words syrupy with false grace. Your Grace, he said, bowing too deeply. My halls are your halls. My food is your food. My rage, long forgotten. Robb apologized, as expected, promised to mend the slight. Walder nodded, even toasted. Wine flowed, musicians played. The tension buried itself behind laughter and meat. But Catelyn felt it in her bones. She watched every servant who moved fast, every guard who drank too little, every smile that didn't reach the eyes. Meanwhile, far from the feast, Roose Bolton stood on the walls, watching the Northmen eat and laugh. His face held no emotion, just cold readiness. Beneath his cloak, his hand rested on a letter won from Tywin Lannister. A deal had been made. Glory for the North's defeat. Warden of the North, titles, lands, legacy, and the price. A family. Inside, the doors were shut. The feast was in full swing. Talisa leaned toward Robb, whispering about the child they would soon have. Catelyn smiled briefly, until she caught something strange. The music had changed. A slower, older song. The Rains of Castamere. Her heart stopped. She looked around. Crossbows, too many guards. Doors bolted. She stood up fast. Robb, but it was already too late. The first arrow struck Talisa in the belly. She screamed, her hand reaching for Robb, blood pouring like a waterfall. He caught her, his eyes wide, as more bolts flew. Northmen fell by the dozens. Chaos exploded. Catelyn lunged for a blade on the table. She grabbed Walder Frey's wife and held the knife to her throat. Let him go, she cried. Let my son go, and I swear. But Frey only smirked. The Lannisters send their regards. Roose Bolton stepped forward, his dagger already bloody. He looked Robb in the eye. The king in the north, he said. And then he plunged the blade into Robb's heart. Catelyn screamed. She slit the girl's throat, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. Her scream became a cry from the old gods, from the first men, from every Stark buried in the crypts of Winter. Then silence. Winterfell didn't hear of the slaughter for 3 days. When the ravens came, the snow had already begun to fall. Arya was near the twins, close enough to hear the wolves howling. She saw the massacre from the woods, saw grey wind die in a storm of arrows. She didn't cry, She didn't scream. She just watched, then turned away, her list growing longer. In King's Landing, Joffrey laughed at the news. Cersei poured wine. Tywin Lannister, always the lion, simply nodded. The North will now remember who rules. But in a cell beneath the Red Keep, Sansa wept silently, the pain finally shattering the mask she wore. And Varys whispered to himself, this was never Ned's plan. This was the kingdom's punishment. Because in truth, Ned Stark had hoped his death would start a fire that lit the way to justice. But justice does not live in weapons, only power. And power, as the Starks learned, plays no fair game. But far in the east, across salt and smoke, Daenerys Stormborn looked west and saw weakness. She saw a continent bleeding from its own pride. And in the north, where ice reigns, something older stirred. The Night's Watch sent no ravens. The dead were walking again. And soon, no crown would matter. The war Ned Stark started with his death was only the beginning of the long night.